Okay, Ben Stimson, let's do this. So we're here to talk about ancestral veneration. So tell us what that is. Let's start with that.
Absolutely, absolutely. So ancestor veneration, it encompasses many different kind of spiritual practices around the world. Often, ancestor veneration sits as a parallel spiritual tradition to more official traditions. So, for example, in a lot of Catholic countries, for example, you have the main bulk of the official religion, and then underneath that, you have regionalized, localized spiritual traditions that sit in parallel with that main tradition. So it will be informed by, but often has a lot more of a local connection. Oftentimes, ancestor veneration is focused on ancestors, but it's also focused on community as well. So you tend to find a lot of smaller community focused practices that were handed down by the ancestors, celebrated within those regions. So one of the best examples is the Mexican Day of the Dead, Dia de los Muertos, and that tradition actually spans globally. It's connected in with the Catholic Day of the Dead and the All Souls and All Hallows. But in Mexico, it's and particularly in southern Mexico, it's really become a localized practice that has then been taken up by the broader community, and even into the United States and around the world. So ancestor veneration, sometimes ancestor worship, depending on how you see the cultural continuum between kind of worship and veneration. We tend to see a lot more idea of veneration in those cultures that are monotheistic and therefore worship is not appropriate to individuals but to God alone, versus those more polytheistic or animistic traditions where the continuum between deities, spirits, and ancestral humans, human spirits, is not as clear cut. So it really is a very broad idea, but it's essentially that belief that the ancestors are not in some dead, far off place and removed from the community, that the ancestors, even though they are dead, continue to be a living part of the community, that are accessible, that are still in communication with, or who are still working with the living, and so unlike the official religion, it tends to also be very community focused, family focused, and very regionally focused.
Okay, so I saw the movie Coco. I love it. For those who haven't seen it, see it, watch it. Pixar is fantastic, and it talks about generational trauma, and it has great music. Now, what I was going to ask is the word veneration has to do with worship and adoration. And I don't really understand that when it comes to our ancestors because I talk to my team on the other side all the time. I have my grandparents and I have my best friend from high school who died unfortunately 10 years ago. Now, I would never say that I worship them or that I adore them. I talk to them. And I don't worship them or adore them because while they were here, they were humans, completely flawed, like I am, like you are, like we all are. And so it sounds strange to me. The same thing in Coco, where you put up a picture and you light candles and you make an offering, but you don't adore your ancestors. You remember them. You talk about them. So it's it it's not like it doesn't sit well with me. It isn't something that I understand, I guess, to use that word, veneration, in relation to people who were human, people who were like me. So what do you say when someone either doesn't get that or feels like it's a bit off?
Well, and it's a very fair point. This is, I think, why language around some of these, or many of these traditions are inadequate, because what you're essentially coming up against is nuanced cultural understanding of our relationships with different types of beings, right? And that all comes from worldview that is informed by official worldview, by official spiritual worldview, and whatnot. In the Judeo-Christian worldview, there worship is only towards spiritual figures like God. Adoration and veneration is towards the saints who are seen as intercessors between God and humanity. And so then veneration and worship are inappropriate in that context. But in cultures that are that don't have those cultural understandings, have different cultural understandings of the nature of the dead or the nature of spirits, worship can very much apply, veneration can very much apply. But even if we were to just use the language of remembering, right? If we were to call it an ancestral remembrance, then I think in the Western culture, at least, I understand you're from the United States as well as Argentina. In the Western cultural understanding, we have these rituals of honoring those dead. We have these rituals of honoring the memories of those dead, and those rituals affirm that worldview that we are not worshipping, we are not venerating these. But even within that worldview, there's nuance, right? Because although we don't tend to think of the saints in this way, the saints are dead ancestors. If you think of it in a lineage sort of way, the saints are dead humans who we venerate, at least in those cultural contexts, that are venerated because they are intermediaries between humanity and God, right? And so, in that way, then veneration, kind of expanding that to all the dead, as in some Christian communities do, doesn't make as much, isn't as much of a hang up, right? So if we were to, again, think of it as cultural remembrance or ancestral remembrance, then the rituals are still there, the honoring is still there, the memory of these ancestors is still there, but they are then relegated to a certain role, a certain type of relationship, and all of the rituals connected around remembering affirm that worldview. Now, for those who are coming from backgrounds where the majority of the culture sees spirits in a different way, and from my own research and my own personal experience, the vast majority of the world see the dead in a different way than kind of a Western concept of them being just separate beings and only human beings, then I think it's about then discovering the type of language that people feel comfortable with. And so that's how I would approach it. How I approach generally this type of work with all of my clients, all the people who are going to be reading my book, is to figure out the worldview that you're comfortable with, that you exist within, that you might have shared with your ancestors, and build a practice based on that worldview. Build a practice based on how you see these individuals or these beings, because it doesn't make sense to adopt something that you don't believe in, right?
Yeah, it might just be the programming, like you said, the ideas that we have of language, the way we were programmed as children and what we were taught. Now, you mentioned that I was from the United States and Argentina. I'm going to segue just a second here. Are you from Scotland? Because you sound like you should be on Outlander.
No, I am originally from North Wales. Right. No, I'm originally from North Wales, but my accent is kind of all over the place because I grew up in Canada. I live just outside of Toronto, and I've been over here for the past 28 years. I do actually have Scottish ancestry. My father's grandfather came from a very northern tip of Scotland, but my accent is Welsh mixed with a little bit of Northern English. So I'm kind of from all over the place, and in truth, that's actually why I got really into this work, because for me, my ancestral connections with my family, my most recent family, was cut when I moved over to Canada, because I don't have any relatives over in Canada that I knew of anyways. It does turn out that a branch of my family 150 years ago moved over here, and I do have distant relatives over here.
Okay, so if we stay with like the whole Outlander thing, because they obviously by going back in time 200 years, they find their ancestors. There are ancestors in this family. So what the same way that the Mexicans have El Dia de los Muertos, what do kind of the Gaelic culture or the Scottish culture, the English culture, what kind of things do they do that is specific to that region of the world when it comes to ancestors or worship or creating ties with your family that has gone on?
Absolutely. So, Great Britain and Ireland all fell within the Christian mindset. And so, a lot of the traditions that have evolved, folk traditions, first of all, a lot of the folk traditions that have evolved on the island are connected to that worldview. The dead are not seen then as. The dead are not seen as beings that you worship, but you can have relationship with them. And a lot of our ghost stories and a lot of our folklore are connected to, like a very rich folklore, are connected to the dead, appeasing the dead. There's a lot of particularly Celtic traditions, Welsh traditions, and Breton traditions around the graveyard, the power of the graveyard. A lot of the, actually, interestingly, a lot of the kind of a Welsh Christian tradition is based on a very old Roman style of Christianity, and so venerating saints is actually a big part of the culture, even after the Protestant Reformation. And so the idea of connecting in with community and the telling of stories is a big piece. Some of the best storytellers in the world come from Scotland, Wales, and Ireland, and to some degree England. I'm not trying to push England down there, but the Celtic culture is very much about storytelling and story proliferation, handing down stories. A lot of the community focus tends to be around remembering the good times, and so a lot of traditions connected to the dead also tend to be traditions of drinking, the community coming together, remembering the good times, singing the songs, telling the stories of these people, and in many ways, handing down the folklore of these people. There's a lot of hero worship that goes on. So this is the kind of a touching point to some of my other areas of interest, particularly folklore, is that you tend to find that the more memorable and powerful ancestors end up becoming legendary figures. This is particularly something that happens a lot in England. And what that does is that elevates that individual to mythic, legendary status. Sometimes they merge and they become, like many individuals, take on many different attributes and then merge into a single character. And sometimes they become kind of regional variations of the same person. So one of the examples is in Shropshire, which is quite close to where I'm from in North Wales. It's on the English side. And there's a very old Anglo-Saxon marcher lord. At that point, that whole region was a border between two big powers, and there was a lot of bloodshed, and everybody in that region would identify with having ancestry on both sides of the border. And so there was a marcher lord that fought on the side of the Welsh against the English, even though he himself was English. And he is now remembered now in folklore as being kind of a Lord of the Dead. He rides around on stormy nights as a spectral figure, and has become part of the landscape. So that's another key piece there too, is that not necessarily, well, I would say worship. It's a very old form of Celtic land worship. It's just been changed and shifted to fit in with Christian worldview. But the idea of worshipping the landscape, becoming part of the landscape when you die, and your stories then being told. So there's quite a lot of different traditions. I think if you were to look at modern Britain and now, you would see a very run-of-the-mill, maybe a very North American approach to the dead. But when you actually get into the villages and smaller places and you recognize what you're actually looking at, the old stories that are told around the fireplaces in pubs often tell stories of these mythical figures who are really dead humans. So I hope that answers the question, Rachel.
Yeah, so now I'm wondering, because all of us new agey people get into something. So I got into Reiki crystals and automatic writing. How did you get into this?
Yeah, for sure. Well, I actually, when I was a teenager, I originally got into paganism, and that whole world back then in the early 2000s. It was a huge kind of everything was online. I was living 2.5 hours outside of Toronto, so I couldn't go to a local occult shop or a metaphysical shop, and I just kind of gravitated towards reading anything to do with goddesses and gods and as you say, crystals and things like that. Um, and so, as I started getting older, I went to university. I took a load of religious studies classes. I gravitated towards Hinduism and Buddhism. And then in my mid-20s, I started working with a group that was looking at Joseph Campbell's monomyth. And it was like an incredible reawakening for me. I ended up going to some festivals with them, and it was like the typical kind of hippie festival, right? You had like, 4 or 5 days of just roaming around in bathing suits, basically, listening to music, and selling things or buying things, crystals and things like that, drumming circles and whatnot. But on a deeper level, there was that looking at story from a spiritual point of view, right? And around that same time, I also connected in with Druidry, which is a neo-pagan practice connected with Celtic tradition. I also became involved in a Cuban, Afro-Cuban tradition called Lukumi, Santeria, and that is working with the spirits of the Yoruba people, the Orishas. Connected to that was Espiritismo, which is a Puerto Rican form of spiritism, Kardecian spiritism. So that really is working with spirit guides and working with the those who have passed in more of a mediumship approach. And so all of these pieces kind of collated and came together for me to give me each a little slice of something, and it all came together with ancestor work. So around that time, I also deeply started working with ancestor work, and particularly ancestor veneration, because at that point I had let go of my kind of older cultural understandings of the dead as just humans that are not worthy of being worshipped or venerated. When I actually looked at the relationships and the power that these people had in my life, because they literally created me, I started seeing them then as part of a continuum between myself and deity. And so that's worthy of being honored, right? The gift of life is worthy of being honored. Plus, also then understanding their role in my life now as deceased guides and individuals on the other side. So that's kind of a nutshell how I got into all of this. And then during the pandemic, I wrote a book on it. So
So I know that there's a lot of people who nowadays are dealing with religious trauma because they come from decades or generations of family where religion was very important, and people are moving more and more into spirituality and not wanting to have a kind of religious dogma and all of that. And so I know that a lot of therapists and coaches are helping people through religious trauma, which I'm guessing decades ago wasn't talked about. So what can you tell us about religious trauma or ancestral trauma?
well, religious trauma and ancestral trauma are two different things. They're related, but they're two different. Two different issues. On the one hand, you have religious trauma, which is an individual's personal experience of trauma from a religion, right? Oftentimes, that's Christianity. I think now we're also starting to see people emerging from Islam and particular kind of charismatic forms of Buddhism, and to some degree Judaism, but there's different relationship there. So in the West, I would say Christianity and Islam are two of the biggest pieces. People are either going to just give up on spirituality and religion at all and just say, I'm not having anything to do with it, and become atheist. Or you find people then searching out um, places of freer expression. And so this is why I think a lot of people come to the New Age, people come to the occult, people come to neo-paganism and magic and whatnot, because they are looking for a newer, more freer place that they can experience and express a spiritual connection to the divine, to something, without the dogmatic restrictions and the trauma that official religion has. I think that this is something that, at least in the West, is a lot more people are a lot more capable of doing, because in other places around the world, the distinction between religion and culture is not there. And so religious trauma happens. Absolutely, it does. But in those cultures, the distinction then between kind of regular things that you do in your life and the religion is not as separated as in the West. And so people don't necessarily identify it in that way. So there's that piece. So individuals having those individual traumatic experiences and then trying to find a new place for themselves in the world. That's very different from ancestral trauma, which is trauma that is handed down through the cultural systems of the family. So if we look at it from a systems point of view, if we look at families as systems that each individual member is a moving part within, then we start to see them not as individuals, we start to see them as collectives. And those collectives are interconnected with collectives that go back in time. So when you have an issue that appears, say, 5 generations ago, that issue will have impacted the generation after it and the generation after that, and so on and so on. And what trauma begets trauma. What often happens with trauma is that people are re-traumatized again and again and again. And it isn't because the traumatic event happens. It's often the coping mechanisms that are employed create new trauma. So a very classic example of this is if alcoholism is an issue in the family, there is usually an issue several generations back. It could be a cultural trauma such as genocide, war, could be a plague, for example, famine, starvation. It could be a particular individual causing a traumatic event that then whoever was the victim of that event or the recipient of that event learned maladaptive coping mechanisms that when they then raised their children created issues in how those children were raised, and so on and so on. And so ancestral trauma, we see this from all sorts of different traumas. Ancestral trauma is a little bit more difficult to get to because as a species, I think we tend to be very narrow-minded. We tend to be very focused on the present. We tend to be very focused on our immediate surroundings. We don't necessarily have the ability to look back in time and say, okay, this is when this happened. This is the thing that happened. Right? We see this in marginalized communities, all sorts of marginalized communities that deal with systemic oppression, that oftentimes that then creates not smaller, but different forms of individuated trauma that then cause problems in families, right? The trauma of slavery is still impacting the African American community now in North America and around the world, even though it was over 100 years ago, right? It started 300 years ago. It's because the systems are still in place that perpetuate those issues. And families are the same way. Families are mini societies. They're smaller societies on a smaller scale. And so if trauma happens 5 generations back, and the family culture develops in a way to protect the family culture from disassembling, from falling apart, then that family culture is going to be enforced again and again and again down the family line, right? A very, 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 very good example of this is there was a scientist did a study with a load of monkeys, and I can't exactly think when, but I know this is floating around the internet. And they took 4 monkeys or 3 monkeys, and they taught them that if they touched a certain thing to get a banana, they would be shocked, or they would have water thrown on them. And then what the scientists did was they removed a monkey and added a new one. And the new monkey saw the banana and went to grab it, and they were all punished. So eventually what happened is they removed all of the original monkeys, and the culture of that small group was developed in such a way that if any monkey tried to grab the banana, regardless of if they were punished or not, the other monkeys would attack him or her, because the fear of that banana and some sort of vague punishment was there, right? And even though none of the monkeys in that circle had experienced the actual original punishment, that's how ancestral trauma works. Families teach rules to keep themselves safe down the line. And so two separate issues, but you can see how they would interrelate, right?
Yeah, that's a horrible story, though.
It is. It was a
I got
horrible
stuck on the
test.
story.
Of course, yeah. No, it's
Poor
a horrible
monkeys.
test, but I know, right? But we're the monkeys of that situation. All of our families, most of our families, deal with those types of trauma. So when it comes to ancestor work, one of the most powerful pieces of this is that not only are we encouraged, at least those of us who are able to do this type of work, to look back then into history and put our how we were raised and our families of origin into context of the families of origins that they originated from. But, and this is where the mediumship piece comes in, you then have access to those ancestors now because they're not gone.
So, Ben, tell us about your book.
Yes, of course. So my book developed in, like I said, just during the pandemic. And I started writing it because I saw a need. I saw a need that there was an interest in working with the dead and dare I say, venerating the dead in a way that that was authentic, that was integral, and also that emerged out of all of our individual kind of worldviews, right? There's a lot of issues, at least in the pagan community, that I was really writing this for, of cultural appropriation, right? People watch the movie Coco, for example, and think that is a prime example of what I want in my life. And so I'm going to do exactly what I see on there, even though that is a very nuanced cultural expression of a relationship between a living community and their dead ancestors, right? So I decided, okay, this is something I want to do. I sat down and I started looking at some of the other material that was available to the community through some of the other books that are written. And there's not that many books written that are not specific to particular traditions. And so I looked at this material and I said, okay, well, what is this actually teaching people, and what else needs to be said? And the material that I had in front of me, many of the books give traditions to follow, give kind of ways to think about the dead, and for me, that didn't feel like it was going to lead anywhere. They're great books, wonderfully written. I know some of the authors that wrote them, and have gotten to know them, and they're wonderful. But I saw that for those who were still not sure, and especially as coming from a therapy background, I was like, okay, that's how I can bridge my therapy work with this spiritual work. So my book is really a big, long, 240-page therapy session. It's asking the right questions. It's kind of laying out examples of worldviews, rituals, relationships, how different cultures see the dead. And then it begs the question, what do you think? What feels right to you and your relationship with your ancestors? And so the central word throughout the book is relationship. Always come back to relationship. And what feels right for your relationship with your ancestors, right? So I, over the past 2 years, I've developed it, and I've received some wonderful feedback from some of the major people in this particular niche of the community, and some wonderful endorsements. But it always came back to that sense of, okay, I'm facilitating this therapy session. What are you going to take out of it? So most of the work in the book is actually journal quotes, like journal questions, right? Go and think about these topics. Go and explore your worldview and your beliefs. And also go deeper. Explore those beliefs that you're not even sure that you have. Explore that worldview. I'm pointing it out for you. I'm pointing out these pieces. Go and explore that worldview that before may have been so subliminal and subconscious and just a regular part of your everyday world that you didn't even recognize, that you were seeing these spirits this way, and then build a relationship with that, or deepen a relationship with that. So that's in a nutshell kind of my approach with the book. The book is out through Llewellyn Worldwide in September. If you go to the Llewellyn website, you can read, I think the first 2 chapters are up there right now, and I hope
What's
you
the
can
name of
enjoy
it?
it if you decide to. So the book is named Ancestral Whispers, A Guide to Building Ancestral Veneration Practices.
Okay, and it'll be available in
Mm-hmm.
September.
September 8th for the United States, and I believe for Canada and Europe, and I think South America too, it's coming out in October.
That's fantastic. Congratulations on that,
Thank
on
you.
writing a book.
Thank
Ben,
you.
thank you so much
Thank you.
for being here today and talking to us and explaining what all of this means. I really appreciate it.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for having me.